I'm Mary Lyons, and I am the Wealth Woman.
And I'm Eric Alexander from Benchmark Income Group.
And this is the Big Wealth Podcast.
Everything you've ever been taught about money is wrong.
But don't worry, we're here to help.
On this podcast, we'll use the same tools you already know to actually help set you free.
Free to do what you want with your time, with your money, and with your energy. Free to live your life the way you have dreamt about.
So we're going to talk about wealth knowledge, personal reflections, and the financial industry news of the day.
Welcome to the Big Wealth Podcast. Today, our special guest is Dr. Ryan Holliman, Director of Dallas Psychotherapy, and he is also a professor. And he is going to talk to us about something that probably almost all of us have struggled with or are struggling with right now, which is how to talk to your spouse about money. So I'll just lead off by saying this kind of conversation we've been talking over the course of the past year almost, and our introduction I think is really kind of a funny story, and I'm just going to throw it out there. But I got an email from you just saying, I think my clients sometimes have issues with money. Maybe your clients need a therapist to talk to them if they're struggling with it. Can we have a conversation? And normally when you get those kind of emails, it's somebody trying to sell you something, or you're like, oh, I'll carve out 10 minutes to see where this goes. But we had some really awesome conversations, and so I'm really excited to have you on board with us today to kind of share your knowledge.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here, and I think this topic is one that I feel like is really important. And obviously, as a couples counselor, there tend to be three things that you deal with: communication, the physical relationship, and money.
Yeah.
So I think this is really important.
Yeah, a huge stressor.
It's the Venn diagram of all things in life, probably up
okay.
on that side of it, right? Well, and it's funny because Mary and I often joke that half of our job is math, the other half is couples counseling. Because it's, inevitably there's some sort of execution moment where it's like, yeah, but I'm not so sure, right?
Yeah, and we see this happen all the time with our clients, is that they're coming from two different places. And so when you have two people in the room who are trying to learn, or have a paradigm shift from where they are to where they need to be, I think sometimes even for us, it becomes you can tell sometimes when you're in treacherous waters. And there's that sort of like, okay, I've got to figure out how to say this on eggshells to get, one spouse caught up with where the other is, or maybe one of them has decent money habits and the other one really doesn't. What do you find usually leads to conflict around finances in a marriage?
I think it all comes down to a conflict between your shared vision for what your relationship is going to be like. I think, and this is true not just for my problems, but when you are in a relationship, you are essentially saying, we want to create a shared life together. And you both have a vision. But I don't know about you guys, but when I went to like premarital counseling, no one talked about, so what you envision your life being like? It's just like, okay, you're not like actively cheating on each other, and you paid the down payment for premarital, so you're good, right? And so I think
for us, we just took a quiz that told us our percentage of like we're in alignment here, and there were it was like if you scored better than a 75% alignment for like, do you want kids? Do you, believe in God or not believe in God? That kind of stuff. They're like, yeah, you're probably okay.
Yeah, well, the rubber stamp that.
Go get him, Tiger. Right.
And so I think that's an important conversation to have about, and one way that I will sometimes get this is a question called the miracle question, which is, if everything in your life was perfect tomorrow, how would I know? What would be different? Now, my least favorite response to that question is, well, I'd win the lottery, right?
Create a lot more problems for you and exacerbate the ones you already have in most circumstances.
But I think the way I get to that is, okay, you win the lottery. Money's never a problem. What are you gonna do? What are you doing differently today or tomorrow that you would do today? And that tends to be the one that gets them to stop and think.
Yeah, where do you want to live? What is that? That's the funny conversation my wife and I have is I'm going to go be in the mountains. She wants to be at the beach. And so it's like, well, we just make enough money that there's 2 houses, I guess, right? I mean, even something as simple as like, where do you park your rear end in the afternoon, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and this idea of shared vision, I think, is so important because, I mean, I think about how many conversations we've had with clients, and my lead-in question is actually very similar to what you say. Even when people, if I meet them networking, they say, "What do you do?" I want to pause for a minute before I start talking about what I do. And the question is turned around to, if money was no object, how would your life be different than it is today? Because that gives me insight into what someone really wants from their life. And I find that frequently people don't have a clear vision from what they want. So the idea that you're supposed to have communicated this vision to your spouse and that you're supposed to be in agreement on what you guys are working towards, I think is almost a foreign concept to a lot of people, because they can't even articulate that individually, let alone from the place of sharing it with another human being.
Well, it takes a lot of knowledge of yourself too, which I think is an important piece, because I think a lot of people get into a relationship without realizing, like, you have to know yourself pretty well if you want this to work out. And one piece of it, like, say you're even able to say, here's my vision. The next piece is, can I explain why that's really important? Like, it's one thing for you to say, I want to live in the mountains. But it's another to say, this is what that means for me.
Right. Well, and there's fear in having that conversation, because what happens on the other end if it's like, yeah, but I can't stand the mountains, right? Or I can't, I mean, that's not the conflict we have, but like there's a trepidation, I think, on the other end of that conversation.
I absolutely. And I think this is all predicated on the idea that you're working to have a good relationship with each other, which, I'll be honest, that's not always the case. When people walk in, I'm like, the best intervention I can give you guys is, we need a DeLorean, some plutonium. We're going to go back in time and make sure you never got in a relationship, because, you're not working together. But I think being able to describe, like, this is what this means for me. This is why it's so important.
I think that this is so relevant because, I would describe my marriage as a pretty healthy marriage, because we early on had to deal with some pretty intense issues and, learn how to fight in a way that's productive, because neither of us grew up in households that were, maybe fighting for a shared vision. Instead, it was fighting to win. And so we had to learn some of that. And at this point, I would say we have a pretty healthy marriage, but we did have some pretty intense conversations around money relatively recently. And it's interesting to see kind of the pieces where there was alignment and there weren't, because over COVID, at some point we rented an RV and we did a 3-week RV trip. And we originally had planned to go into Colorado and then over to the west so that we could go over to Zion in Utah and, Arches and all of that. But while we were on the trip, Colorado was basically on fire. And so the routes to get into Utah were shut down. So we went the other direction and we went into New Mexico, and we spent some time in the Angel Fire Taos area. And while we were there, because it was in, I think, late August, early September, I just fell in love with Taos because the weather was so beautiful. And when you contrast a New Mexico, like especially in the Taos area, August, to a Dallas August, where it's like 110 degrees and humid and just disgusting, I was like, can I just spend all my time here? And, while we were there, I sort of built in my head this vision of, like, we could come here for at least a month of time in the summer and the weather would be great and I can work remotely. And then, in the winters and over spring break, we can come and the kids can ski. And so I sort of created this whole story of like what Taos could mean. And the attachment there was really about the creation of memories and tradition as a family unit. And I don't think that I knew, like, I don't think I was aware that that was what my attachment was until actually you and I had a conversation just kind of as an aside and talking about what would be relevant to our audience. And I was like, God, this explains so much of the problem I had communicating with my spouse, because I told him, I was like, I would like to buy a house in Taos, and I'd like a Taos house is what I said. And he was like, what, why? And I was like, I don't know, I just love it here. And he was like, I mean, I'm not going to tell you no if that's what you really want, right? Like you work, you have your own money. Like we're building as a unit if this is important to you. But I remember, on the way home, things got kind of heated because he was like, I don't get it. And I was like, why do you have to? Like, it was weird what happened in my head, because I was like, if I'm telling you this is important to me, it should be important to you. But I couldn't, but it's that idea of there was no sharing of the vision between the two of us. And when I could finally articulate to him that it was about building tradition and memories, and that, if they had all these positive associations with it, that even when our kids grew up and became adults, maybe they would come back and bring their kids here. And it would be sort of this continuing thing. But it wasn't until I could articulate that he actually got on board with the idea of having a Taos house. And then how we're getting there is a totally different path, because we're building, several rental properties that are going to generate the income to then pay for the house that maybe I don't want to rent out. And so we have this whole path. But that idea of really connecting over the shared vision, I think, is so important, because if you don't have that, I think it does create tension, because the other person just, why is it important? I don't know why you think that's important. That seems dumb to me. Like that was his initial, I don't need this. So
and to Mike's credit, because I've been on the other end of these conversations, it's like, hey, how's it going? Hey, we need to do X. And it's like, what? I just wanted a hello, how are you? Right. I didn't, because you didn't see all of the the thought processes going on in your head. It just went from, hi, how's it going? We need to go to the moon. It's like, wait, how did we get past, where did this come from? Right.
I think that's a great point. One thing I talk with couples about is scheduling these conversations, because without fail, I would have couples that like, yeah, we were in the car and the kids were screaming in the back, and I decided that was a good time to talk about a house in Taos. And it's like, yeah, no, you just set yourself up to fail, pal. And we've all done that. Like, I've done it, right?
Right.
I've got a PhD in doing that. I kill that all the time.
So I think, the other thing that I've seen, and, I'll be real transparent about it. Probably my husband will listen to this podcast and be like, why are you telling everybody everything that happens in our relationship? But I do find that sometimes when we have conflict, it comes from the fact that we were raised very differently. Right. Like I look at how money was used in our household, and I come from generations of entrepreneurs on one side, and on the other side, some trust fund babies. And so money is something that has on one side of the family just always been there. And, you can count on it because they did all the planning properly. And so it flows through. And that to me speaks to the importance of planning. And at some point we'll have to tell that whole story, because it's an interesting one.
A great story.
Yeah, I'll lead into that maybe for another podcast. But on the other side of the family, I think my dad has about 50 first cousins. They're of Irish descent, and then they married into Mexican families, and they're all Catholic. So procreation is a thing that happens there. But he's got 50 first cousins, and I think all but 2 of them are either entrepreneurs or work in a family business. And so when you think about the mentality that comes with that about money, is that it's a tool, and that if you work hard or work smart, you can create more of it. And so I really grew up, even through like skinny times and times where we had a lot of money, because there was definitely some fluctuation, is that even the times where there wasn't a lot of money, that was just temporary. Right. And it was, you just use the resources you have available to you, and you can create it again. And it just depends on what you're doing, and with the right effort, it's there. And if I contrast that to the way my husband was brought up, on his side of the family, they were dirt farmers in Oklahoma. And so, money was not a thing that there was a lot of, and that was true for generations. And so, when we had probably one of our more recent conversations about money, I was talking about, my vision for the future, and how I want to build something that impacts our community and that sets up our children and our grandchildren for success, and sort of this idea of this generational wealth, and how because this is what I do, I don't think it's that hard to actually do that, even if you have a conservative income. And he was like, yeah, I don't understand that. And part of the reason when we really started digging into it, that he was like, why do you need to do that? Is because for him, the lifestyle that we're living today is like beyond what he dreamed of for himself. And so the need to go beyond this for him kind of didn't exist. He was like, we're great. Like, we're successful, we're comfortable, we don't want for much of anything. And he's like, so what is it that you want to do? And this sort of, it wasn't until, like, I didn't realize, we've been married for almost 15 years. It'll be 15 years. I had never shared this vision with him of what I was trying to build financially. And so all these times where I would want to make a decision and he was like, what are we doing? Why would we do that? I always saw that as like some weird resistance. And it wasn't until we had this conversation that it, you know, even about the histories of how we think about money and why I want to do the things I want to do, that for the first time he was like, I understand it and I'm on board with it. Like, let's make it happen. But before that, it was like, why won't you come on this journey with me? Why aren't you on this journey that I'm trying to take? And for him, it was because he didn't know I was on a journey.
Right. Well,
Right.
and it probably feels greedy at some point. Like, what do you need more? What more do you need, woman? Right. You know?
When I think for me, I always look at our past gives us rules about how to live life. And we don't necessarily know what they are. That's why we go to therapy. But knowing what those are for different people are important. For example, for me, my mother was the bookkeeper in the home, and her family were serial entrepreneurs, so she did the books for all of them. And it was conservative. So I was always like, if you think you're gonna need $100,000, save 300. Like, always be prepared for a crisis. Whereas my wife, her family had more money, not like generational wealth money, but certainly they weren't hurting, medical family. And it was always about service. Like, her great grandmother was like an arch liberal progressive. And she said, oh, well, you just need to think about when you pay your taxes, what all help you're going to be providing people, when what all good that's going to go for. So for her, it's about giving money. And so we have to sort of have discussions when we're talking about our charitable giving, where she's like, oh, let's give all this. I'm like, well, maybe we could ramp it back a little bit. And so those are
security.
Yeah. So, but we have two different rules, and we have to know like how those are butting up against each other if we're gonna have a good conversation.
So do you have any tips that people can use to either help create that shared vision, or to understand not just their money rules, right, but their spouses in a way that is maybe non-judgmental? Because I think sometimes when people get into these conversations about money, because their rules are different, I mean, they have different blueprints, right? I mean, it's like I'm going to use I guess a reference that will make me old, but it's like taking a tape and sticking it in the VCR and playing a video, right? And so you like go back into your brain and there's a conversation about money and this video starts playing. And so how can people, what are some usable tools that they can put into play in their conversations to have a productive conversation about money, as opposed to, okay, we brought this up and now we're going to have a big fight?
Right. So I think there are a few things that come to mind. One is when you're talking about the shared vision, the impetus is not on just one person to explain their vision. The one person is supposed to explain, like, hey, here's what's going on, but the other person's job is to draw that out. So questions like, help me understand what meaning that has for you. What will it mean if we do have that house and house, if we live in the mountains? What associations come up for you when you think of that?
It's sort of like a joint unearthing kind of thing, because the idea, and I'm this is a question that's going to sound like a statement, but is it the idea that the person that's sharing the vision may not be able to go 4 layers down into what that means?
Yeah.
They're just sharing, I want a house and house.
Yeah, and they may need help because you've been with these thoughts for so long. You're like, well, yeah, it just makes sense. Like, why would I even need to say that a house and towels would be family tradition?
It's
like,
self-evident, right?
Yeah. So it is about, I sort of talk about using the Jane Goodall approach. Assume this is the first species of its kind you're ever talking to. Let's figure everything we can about how they operate. I think another thing to remind yourself is a healthy relationship has a window and a fence. It's a window between the two partners so that you can fully see each other, and a fence around you and the rest of the world. So identifying the problem is not between us, but external to us. Our job is to solve this problem rather than winning and saying like, okay, I won this argument, I got this.
I get my house, I win, right? That's not the goal.
Right.
No, that generally doesn't work well.
Well, and the best analogy I heard on that, or the explanation, is if you win and your partner loses, then you're married to a loser. Is that what you really want? Right? Like is that how you want to perceive them? Like, I beat them, they're a loser, and now I'm the one that wins, right? It's not, that's not healthy long going.
No.
I think the other thing when it comes to negotiation is there are two things you need to talk about. So say you've cast this vision, but now it gets to the how or the what or the will we. You need to talk about the places where you're flexible and the places where it feels like if I give this up, it will be giving up my very soul. Right? So you need to have very clear ideas about what doors can be gone through and what doors have been plastered over with big warning signs on them. Right.
So I'm gonna keep using this Taos example. So one of the things that that Mike and I talked about was does it have to be Taos? Like if you once he understood that what was important to me, and once I understood that what was important to me was really about the tradition and the family connection. There are other locations where we could do that. And so when I look at how we're planning our trips and vacations this year, it's around exploring other locations to see if the same feelings are there in other locations that might, be more financially profitable long term, or that are easier or quicker to get to. Or that maybe have different amenities that are important to one or the other of us. And so I think that idea of flexibility is so key. And I think we didn't have that conversation, or I didn't even make that connection until you pointed it out when we were talking, because, when he was like, yeah, but why Taos? I was like, I don't know. I like the architecture. I like the artist community. And he's like, but you could have all that in Santa Fe and it's an hour closer. Right. And I was like, maybe we should go to Santa Fe then, right? And so it's, I don't know. I think that idea of flexibility is key, because sometimes you can accomplish the same thing in a different way that works better as a unit, even though it may not be what you initially envisioned.
Well, but that's your point on that, Ryan. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry, but your point on that, Ryan, is like Mike sort of fell into that role perfectly, in that he was sort of drawing out that, okay, yeah, but is this a door, or is it or what would you call it? Is this flexible, or is this soul sucking, right? Or is this, what is it really about Taos, or is it about this other thing, right?
Well, that's a great example of you partnering together to find a solution, right? And so I think that's a great just picture of like, share the vision, understand why it's important, come up with multiple options. And that's one thing when I work with couples is what we tend to do is like, this is the way we can solve my problem. Let's do this. And so what I'll say is, don't do that. I want you to come up with 10 possible solutions, even if they're kind of ridiculous. Like I had a couple once that the mother-in-law was problematic. And I was like, I don't care how ridiculous it is, just come up with, and one of their solutions was we could move to Iceland. I'm like, okay, that's definitely a possibility.
Let's put a pin in that.
But it's about figuring out multiple ways. I had a personal therapist who said, your measure of health is how many options you have in any given situation. And so the more narrow we get, the more stressed I think we end up being.
Yeah. So if someone is talking to their spouse, let's say there's an issue where one spouse is overspending, And, interestingly, I had a client and he was a good earner. His wife stayed at home. She was out of control with the spending. They ended up getting divorced because of it. They are now remarried because that's what it took for her to take the problem seriously, I think. But I think for most of us, we would like to avoid that extreme, right? Like we would like to find a solution before it gets to that point. So in a situation where one person's behavior is problematic, are there things that you can do to address that? And maybe I'll go a little deeper. So I had a conversation, different client over the past couple of weeks, and their spouse doesn't seem to mind debt or overdrafting an account. And so they are constantly trying to prevent things from getting out of control, but it is making it difficult for them to be productive and to find ways to move forward. And so in this household, the one who is trying to make everything work is really managing everything about the finances, or trying to. And so there's some difficulty in the conversations because having the account overdrafted doesn't seem to be a problem for the other spouse. Like, it's not a stress trigger. They're like, it's fine, I'll just pay the fee and the money will show up when we get our next paycheck. So in a situation where maybe some of the dynamics are more difficult and the spouses do truly love each other, but they're really operating on different planes when it comes to money, how do you open a conversation like that? Does it go back to that shared vision idea, or are there some kind of even like tangible tactics to avoid setting off a landmine, because the person who's bringing it up has a very emotional tie to the outcome, and the person on the other end may or may not realize that their behavior is causing the tension?
Right. So I think one trap that just we as human beings run into is we state a negative need. We state, I need you to stop overdrafting the account, jerk. And that really doesn't help. And so what I say is express your feeling. So I get nervous when X happens. So I get anxious when I see an overdraft notice. And then state what you positively need. When you tell someone don't do something, that's the first thing they're going to want to do. So stating like, here's what I might need. Okay, so that's one thing. I think the other thing for me, and it depends how complex this is as to whether you need a therapist for this or just a couples conversation, but what's the significance of this behavior? For example, is it, I'm just so disorganized, I never balance my checkbook, so who knows how much is in there? I just hope there is enough. Is it shopping makes me feel good, and so I need something to feel better about myself, and that's why I spend so much? Is it, I've got so much student debt that I'm always going to be in debt. Why not add a little extra on it? The only way I'm going to get out of this is die, so let's go that way. So I think it's really understanding with acceptance the motivations that are underneath the spending patterns. Go ahead.
So I love what you're saying, because it is about listening for understanding as opposed to listening for judgment. And I think that so frequently, especially with money, like if you feel like, hey, overdrafting the account is wrong, then we approach the entire conversation from that sort of black and white, what you're doing is wrong, it's bad behavior, we're classifying it, we are making a judgment. Right. And the only thing that does is make our partner defensive, right? Yeah. And it doesn't lead to any kind of change. And so do you have tips for like even language or conversations that someone could have with themselves prior to going into that, right? Because if you're having a conversation with a spouse about overdrafting accounts, you want them to stop. And so you feel like this is a bad thing, you need to stop doing it, you're preventing us from getting to this vision. How do you set aside all of that emotion so that you can have a productive conversation that eventually, hopefully, leads to change when, there could be anger around? what if they've done the math and you've lost, $4,000 to overdraft charges over the past couple of years, and you're like, I mean,
No, yeah. So I think there are a few things. One is I think you need to, before you go in, remind yourself there's a difference between a complaint and a criticism. A complaint says, I don't like this behavior. I find it problematic. So it's like, Eric, I really don't like it when you spend $10,000 a month on shoes. I would prefer you not. A criticism is you are a greedy, selfish person who could care less about your family. How dare you do this?
Right. But I care about Alan Edmonds. I've got to keep these guys in business, right?
If you're spending 10 grand a month on shoes, you're not buying Alan Edmonds, let's be honest. Like,
I just have a lot of them apparently at that point.
I mean, at that point, you've got a collection you have to maintain, right? So I think that's one thing. The other thing, and both criticism and this next thing are predictors of divorce in the short term, is contempt. So there's this concept of positive sentiment override and negative sentiment override. It's a really complicated way of saying a simple thing. Do you believe your spouse is trying their best and trying to do good for you and the family? Or do you believe they're trying to screw you over at every turn, right? I sort of describe it as when you don't like someone at work, even the way they eat crackers annoys you. Like, look at her eating crackers like she owns the place. Get out of here, right? We can do that with our spouse. Like, they are so lazy. They never do anything. And so I think you have to go in and remind yourself, what are all the good things that are true about this person? Because if there was nothing good, then I'd just be divorced at this point. There's got to be some good stuff I remind myself of. Don't let this one thing overshadow the 20 other things.
The other good things.
The last thing I'll say is you need to know when to tap out. There's been some research that after your heart rate gets above a certain level, you're not even auditorily processing information accurately anymore. So if you are getting agitated, know when it's a lost cause, not like lost forever, but like we've gotten too heated. We need to cool down before we have further conversations.
That's interesting because I remember, that's really fascinating actually. But there's a great story about the empty boat, right? And Mary, you've talked about this before. Never attribute to malevolence
what attribute to maliciousness what should be attributed to stupidity.
Yeah, but I think it's not. I think stupidity is probably the wrong tagline on the back one, but I think it's maybe indifference. Like to talk about the lady that was overdrafting the account. Like, I'm not trying to do this to like ruin our future. I'm just not paying attention. Like there's 4,000 other baby ducks nibbling at my feet. I'm taking care of those, and I'm not thinking about this other thing. But it doesn't make me malicious. And to your point, right? I'm not trying to sort of ruin every aspect of your life and kill us all, right? I'm just not paying attention. I'm just looking at shoes. Right. I mean, they make them in brown and black. We need both.
I think my wife's a physician, and she has some colleagues who are like really on point with all the bureaucracy that doctors have to deal with. And she had this one colleague that I love this phrase. He said, "I'll get to that 10 minutes before I'm fired." Yep. And so you have these different personalities, and they're different values, right? Like, I want to be doing mess, and I don't want to be doing this accreditation stuff. So I'm putting that off till the last minute. Can be the same with overdrafting or any sort of financial thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think that's helpful. I like the idea of the what did you call it? An emotional override almost?
The sentiment override. Yeah.
Sentiment override, right? Where if everything is working perfectly, why did I marry this person in the first place? What do they bring to this relationship that makes my life better? Right. And when you can tap into that prior to a conversation, you go in from a place of love, right? As opposed to judgment and anger and all of that. I think this is great. I think that is frequently the hardest thing is that when if one client has, a vision for this and they feel like they're marching forward, then, if their partner is not on the same page, that certainly makes our job harder, but I think it makes their life harder too.
Yeah.
And that's,
Right.
that's where I think these conversations are so good. And I will say, I mean, in the years that I've been doing this, there are frequently times where in the conversation, through sharing even conversations that Mike and I have had, or where we've had trouble, where we make the recommendation that, you guys should probably go talk to someone who is qualified to help you process through some of these issues. Because, I mean, the money is there. I could do the math all day long, but money really is just a tool. And if you have ideas about we should have this tool versus this tool, or, we don't need that many tools, and the other one's like, yes, we do. It helps to have people who are on the same page. And I think this is something that is more common than most people will admit, because we are all raised in different households with different conversations about money. And until you can get to at least the idea of these things should be there together, I think it's hard to do. Because if you have one spouse who comes from a household that says, I don't care if we leave the kids anything, I'm spending every penny and I'm going to slide into my grave broke, that's very different than if the other spouse says, well, I inherited money and that made our lives easier, so I want to make sure that I set our kids up for the same thing. Those are two totally different outcomes there. And the planning around that is different depending on what you want to do.
And I would say for me, the most important part is to have these conversations early.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I talk about with clients, and this is something that is sort of a broad concept, but it's about risk-aware consent. Like, I always want people to know, like, what am I walking into? And so I don't want you to have this conversation like after you've been married 15 years. I want you to have this conversation before you're deciding, do I really want to take this beyond just a casual relationship? Like, am I going to be, is my credit score going to take a drop because I just hooked my trailer to this person? I've certainly, as an academician, I've certainly seen a lot of people are like, oh, I had no idea I was going to be marrying someone with, 6-figure debts.
Right.
So yeah.
That is shocking to me, because I think the moment I was even remotely serious with Mike, I was like, open the kimono. Like, I need to see credit card debt, what your income is, where you think you're going to go. But I think some of that is just a function of like my personality, whereas other people are afraid of that being uncomfortable or creating conflict. I don't have a problem with conflict. Maybe I do. It's just in the other direction. I don't know.
Right.
But I do think that frequently people don't have those conversations. And I had the, I don't know if I would use the word opportunity, but to talk to a couple who, it was a second marriage for her. And the first marriage, the husband kind of took care of everything. And the second marriage, the gentleman, this is the one that came in, the gentleman had told her he was going to take care of everything. And then after they got married, they had the conversation about money and he didn't have any. So it's actually her taking care of everything. And so, that was interesting, because they were already having conversations about trust and that sort of thing. And then I was supposed to go through and have the money conversation. But I was like, you're starting in the wrong place. Like, I don't think any of these conversations about where you should invest your money should be happening right now. You have a totally different issue that needs to be addressed first, and so it is, I think as advisors, we can be sensitive to some of those things, but I think having tangible and actionable items that people can implement in the conversation is really helpful. So thank you so much for that advice. I know we're definitely going to want to have you come back on, because I think one of the topics that we'd like to talk about is why people make decisions about money that they know are not good for themselves. So overspending, or even something along the lines of, you make a bad investment and then you see someone who's made a bad investment throw more money at it because they're like, no, it's going to come back, and it's throwing good money after bad at that point. So I would
cost bias and all that, right?
Yeah, I would love to get your take on that. So we'll definitely make sure that we have you back on specifically for that topic. Is there anything that we should have asked you about couples and money that we just didn't think to ask?
I think the one sort of thing I'll leave, and this is both couples and money, is early intervention is what works the best. So if you think you have a problem, you probably waited 5 minutes too long. If you have a big problem, you've waited way too long. Prevention is, I think this is true with money and with relationships and emotions. Always take the temperature and see where you're at and intervene early rather than putting it off. Procrastination only hurts you.
Yeah, it only gets worse at that point. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan.
We really appreciate your time. To our audience, we'll see you next time. Have a great day.